February 8th, 1944. 074 3 hours. The Anzio beachhead was quiet in the uneasy way that only artillery ground could be quiet. Lieutenant Klaus Müller of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division scanned the fields through his binoculars, not expecting to see anything unusual. The farmhouse ahead had already been hit twice. The irrigation ditches were filled with rubble, shell fragments, and mud. No Allied patrol would be foolish enough to move in daylight here. The old farmer appeared, bent at the waist, dragging a hoe through the ruined soil as if the war did not exist. His clothes were patched and faded, clearly pre-war. His hands were dark with dirt. He looked like a man who had survived decades of poverty and would likely die in the same field he was born in. German soldiers passed within meters of him, into the sun, and gave a tired wave. One of the soldiers laughed and called out a greeting in broken French. The old man nodded and returned to his work. Müller lowered his binoculars, harmless, invisible. What Müller did not see was that every movement of the hoe followed a pattern. The farmer paused at fixed intervals, not to rest, but to observe. His eyes never lingered. He counted without writing, measured without tools, memorized without effort. Gun nest in the stable. Mortar position behind the stone wall. Patrol cycle, 18 minutes. Guard change, 0800. The soil, less than a meter from where he stood, ran a severed Allied telephone line. Without it, artillery observers were blind. Men were dying because messages could not get through. The farmer worked closer to the break. Ruins, their scopes drifting lazily across the fields. They saw nothing worth shooting. Just an old man who shook with effort and groaned when he bent too far. And they ignored was not Italian. He was not old, and he was not a farmer. He was Thomas George Prince, 28 years old, a sergeant of the 1st Special Service Force. He wore civilian clothes stolen from a dead man. Beneath the dirt on his hands were the instincts of a hunter raised to disappear, to wait, to endure. He understood something the Germans did not. A dangerous man is not the one who attacks. It is the one who is never noticed at all. The cover held because it was ordinary. Nothing about the old farmer demanded attention. He did not rush. He did not linger. He followed the rhythm of men who had worked land their entire lives. Slow steps, shallow breaths, small complaints muttered at no one in particular. German sentries learned to read danger through movement, not stillness. Anything that tried to hide drew suspicion. Anything that behaved as expected vanished. The farmer vanished perfectly. He worked the same narrow strip of ground, always in view, never in the same place for long. He hoed, cleared debris, straightened, groaned, wiped his brow. When aircraft passed overhead, he did not look up. When artillery thumped in the distance, he flinched just enough to appear human. While his mind was building a map they made on broken stone, he counted vehicles by the delay between engine noise and dust clouds. He noticed which officers carried maps and which carried nothing at all. He learned which positions were real and which were decoys, which guns fired regularly and which were silent most of the day. Germans believed they owned the daylight. He used it against them. At mid-morning, a lieutenant stopped 10 feet from him, hand resting casually on a Luger. The officer studied the farmer's face, searching for something that did not belong. The farmer met his gaze with tired eyes and said nothing. He gestured at the ruined field, then at his stomach, and cursed the war in what sounded like badly pronounced Italian. The lieutenant laughed onto the ground and walked away. Moments later, while tying his bootlace, the farmer slipped his fingers into the soil and found copper. He stripped the insulation with his thumbnail and twisted the wire together beneath the dirt. The line came alive. Minutes, Allied guns began to speak. Noon, the second, followed by evening. German officers blamed bad luck, then Allied air spotting, then spies who did not exist. They never suspected the man they waved to each morning. Second day, the farmer changed fields. Patterns got men killed. He appeared later than before, worked slower, coughed more. German patrols passed closer now. One captain stared too long. The farmer's hands trembled, not with fear, but with precision. Weakness disarmed suspicion better than confidence ever could. Third day, the risk became absolute. A German soldier walked directly toward the buried wire. He fell forward into the mud, clutching his chest, gasping like a man whose body had finally surrendered. German soldiers rushed in. A medic checked his pulse. Voices argued. Minutes stretched into an eternity measured in heartbeats. The farmer finally stirred. Apologetic and ashamed, an 18-year-old German helped him to the farmhouse and told him the war would be over soon. An hour later, the coordinates that boy helped protect were erased by artillery. By the time the farmer disappeared from the fields, nearly 200 German soldiers were dead. No firefight, no ambush, no heroics visible to anyone watching. The man they believed was harmless, turning their certainty into a weapon against them. When the shelling stopped, the Germans searched for patterns. Interrogated villagers, questioned patrol leaders, blamed radio intercepts and aerial observers. Intelligence officers rewrote reports late into the night, convinced the Allies had slipped reconnaissance teams through the lines under cover of darkness. No one mentioned the farmer. No one remembered his face well enough to describe it. The point. George Prince. Anzio was not an anomaly. It was the natural result of a life spent learning how to exist without being seen. Long before uniforms and ranks, he had learned that survival depended on reading the land, not fighting it. You did not challenge an enemy directly when patience could defeat him more efficiently. And who trained him never understood where that calm came from. They saw the results during escape and evasion exercises, when search dogs lost his trail within minutes. They saw it during night movement drills, when instructors stumbled and cursed, while Prince moved like part of the terrain itself. They labeled the skill instinct because they lacked better language. What they never saw was the childhood behind it. Been taken from his family and stripped of his language, his hair, his name. He had been taught that everything he came from was inferior, backward, primitive. The school tried to erase what his grandfather had taught him. It failed. Lessons returned in Italy. That modern war was not always won by firepower or technology. It was won by understanding people. The Germans respected force. They distrusted youth. They ignored the old, the poor, the exhausted. So that was what he became. Days of pretending achieved what weeks of assaults could not. Artillery batteries were silenced. Patrol routes were mapped. Enemy confidence was broken. Allied infantry advanced with knowledge instead of guesswork, and hundreds of lives were spared because someone had been willing to be overlooked. Prince finally reported back. His commander stared at him in disbelief. He had stayed in full view of the enemy for 72 hours, dressed as a civilian. If captured, he would have been executed without trial. No convention would protect him. No uniform would identify him as a soldier. He accepted the risk without comment. It was familiar. The real threat was never the Germans who nearly caught him, or the officers who questioned him, or the artillery that shook the ground beneath his feet. The real danger was the assumption that he did not belong, that he was less capable, less intelligent, less human. Anzio, that assumption killed 200 men. And it did so without ever realizing who had defeated them. The war did not end for him at Anzio. It followed him north, into the mountains of southern France, where certainty disappeared and mistakes meant entire units vanished without a trace. In September 1944, German forces withdrew into the Maritime Alps, 800 men dissolving into terrain, too steep for vehicles and too dangerous for blind pursuit. Allied commanders knew a trap was waiting. They just did not know where. They sent the man who could move where maps failed. Sergeant Thomas George Prince volunteered without hesitation. No radio, no support, 3 days of rations, 70 kilometers behind enemy lines. He moved at night, reading the land the way others read printed orders. During the day, he hid in rock crevices while German troops rested within arm's reach, unaware they were sharing shelter with the enemy. The third day, he found them. Vehicles camouflaged under trees. Artillery positioned to slaughter the first Allied advance, foolish enough to enter the valley. The information was decisive, but information meant nothing unless it reached headquarters. The return journey would take days, days the Allies did not have. Prince made a choice that bordered on suicidal. Not cautiously, not tactically. He ran straight through enemy territory in daylight, stripping himself to the bare minimum and trusting speed, shock, and audacity. When patrols appeared, he did not hide. He broke through them. When vehicles gave chase, he vanished into vineyards and stone walls. By kilometer 30, his feet were bleeding. By 50, dehydration blurred his vision. It was familiar. He ignored it. Collapsed at Allied lines, delivered the coordinates, drank water until his hand stopped shaking, and insisted on leading the force back himself. At dawn, the trap closed. 1,000 prisoners were taken. Not a single Allied casualty. Battles came later. The handshakes, the photographs. He stood in palaces and listened as men in polished uniforms praised courage and sacrifice. He accepted the honors quietly, as he always had. The war ended. It treated him as if he had never existed. Its promise to veterans were halved for men like him. Medical care required proof he was responsible enough to deserve it. Land grants came with strings that erased identity. Equality was offered only in exchange for surrendering who he was. These soldiers had called him grandfather. His own nation called him a problem. By the time the uniforms were folded away, the skills that had won battles no longer mattered. The man who had outwitted entire divisions mopped floors. The warrior who had endured mountains and shellfire fought ghosts alone. Alcohol dulled them. Nothing silenced them. And the war claimed him anyway. Enemy fire, but slowly, quietly, in the shadow of a victory that had never truly been his. When he died, the country finally remembered his name. His appeared. Uniforms were pressed. Speeches were written about courage, sacrifice, and duty. A full military honor guard fired into the cold sky, each shot echoing across a nation that had ignored him while he was alive. Foreign representatives attended. Veterans stood at attention. His medals, once pawned to survive, gleamed behind glass. Called him a hero. Where he slept. They did not mention the forms that denied him care. They did not mention that the man who had fooled entire German divisions could not outmaneuver bureaucracy. The story they told was clean, too clean. But not the price paid afterward. They celebrated the myth, not the man. It was easier that way. Easier to admire bravery than to confront betrayal. Thomas George Prince had spent his life proving something to people who never wanted proof. He had shown that the skills dismissed as primitive were perfectly suited for modern war. That patience could defeat machinery. That observation could overpower firepower. That being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Combat, the enemy learned too late. Learned it all. Germans at Anzio saw an old man and chose to look away. They paid for that mistake with their lives. Canada saw a decorated Indigenous veteran and chose to look past him. It paid nothing at all. The quiet truth buried beneath the medals. Faced was not armed. It wore no uniform. It never fired a shot. Simply decided that some lives were worth less after the war than during it. And that is why his story matters. This is not honor, because medals without dignity are just metal, and because sometimes the nation a soldier fights for becomes the last thing he must survive. Mocked the primitive Indian, they celebrated the war hero, but they never truly saw the man. That blindness cost far more than any battlefield ever did. The story of Thomas George Prince is not just a wartime narrative. It is a case study in how modern societies misunderstand skill, misjudge people, and repeatedly confuse surface appearances with real capability. The lesson does not live in the number of Germans killed at Anzio, nor in the medals pinned to his chest, nor even in the brutality of his post-war neglect. It lives in the structure of the thinking that surrounded him from childhood to death. His life exposes patterns that repeat far beyond World War II, patterns that still shape institutions, armies, governments, and cultures today. The first lesson is about visibility and power. Modern systems are built around what can be measured, categorized, and seen. Rank, uniforms, credentials, paperwork, and appearances form the basis of trust. What does not fit those structures is treated as irrelevant or inferior. Prince survived and succeeded precisely because he operated outside that logic. At Anzio, the Germans controlled firepower, manpower, and terrain. They believed dominance came from occupying space and projecting force. What they failed to understand was that control of perception mattered more than control of ground. Prince did not challenge their strength, he bypassed it. He allowed them to see what they expected to see, and by doing so, he gained freedom of action inside their own defenses. It is not merely a battlefield lesson, it is a universal one. Organizations routinely collapse not because they lack resources, but because they misread their environment. They focus on threats that look like threats and ignore those that do not. Prince demonstrates that invisibility is often the most powerful position available. By conforming outwardly, he gained inward autonomy. By appearing weak, he became untouchable. Modern institutions remain vulnerable to this dynamic because they reward performance rather than perception, output rather than understanding. The second lesson concerns the false divide between primitive and modern. Prince's skills were dismissed as outdated because they did not originate in formal institutions. He learned tracking, patience, stillness, and observation through oral tradition and lived experience rather than manuals and classrooms. These skills were labeled backward because they lacked technological markers. Yet on the battlefield they proved superior to mechanical surveillance, rigid doctrine, and standardized training. This exposes a deep cultural bias, the assumption that progress is linear and that newer systems automatically replace older forms of knowledge. In reality, knowledge evolves in layers. Traditional skills are not obsolete simply because they are old. They persist because they are adaptive. Indigenous hunting practices were refined over centuries through direct feedback from the environment. Failure meant starvation or death. There was no margin for theoretical error. By contrast, many modern systems protect themselves from failure through bureaucracy. Mistakes are absorbed by paperwork, committees, and abstraction. The cost is delayed learning. Prince's abilities represented compressed evolution, knowledge distilled by necessity. The tragedy is not that these skills existed, but that institutions refused to recognize their value until war forced them to. The third lesson is about identity as both weapon and vulnerability. Prince's identity made him invisible to the enemy and disposable to his own government. In combat, being underestimated saved his life and multiplied his effectiveness. In peace, the same underestimation destroyed him. This reveals a brutal truth. Societies often exploit marginalized identities when convenient and discard them when inconvenient. The state celebrated his effectiveness as a soldier while denying his humanity as a citizen. The contradiction was not accidental. It was structural. Governments are efficient at extracting service but inefficient at granting dignity. Prince's experience after the war illustrates how institutional respect is conditional. During wartime, his value was operational. Afterward, value was measured in compliance with bureaucratic norms that were designed to exclude him. The Veterans Land Act and medical benefit systems were not neutral failures. They were mechanisms built on assumptions about who deserved investment and who required control. Prince did not fit the model of the ideal veteran because that model was racialized, bureaucratic, and fundamentally unequal. The lesson lies in the psychology of endurance. Prince survived experiences that would have broken most people, not because he was immune to pain, but because he understood it differently. Pain, to him, was information rather than command. This mindset was shaped long before military training. It was reinforced by institutional abuse in residential schools, where emotional suppression became a survival mechanism. War did not create his resilience. It merely exploited it. It reveals a dangerous paradox. Societies often celebrate resilience without questioning why it was necessary. Prince's ability to endure suffering was praised on the battlefield and ignored in civilian life. The same traits that made him an effective soldier made him vulnerable to post-war neglect. Resilience became an excuse for abandonment. Because he endured, the system felt no urgency to care. This is a recurring pattern in how societies treat those who survive trauma. Survival is mistaken for recovery. Endurance is mistaken for consent. The next lesson concerns the moral asymmetry between enemies and institutions. One of the most unsettling elements of Prince's story is that enemy soldiers often treated him with more humanity than his own government did. German soldiers gave him food, assisted him, and spoke to him as an elder. These were not acts of ideological enlightenment. They were human responses stripped of bureaucracy. In contrast, post-war institutions interacted with Prince through forms, classifications, and regulations that erased individuality. It does not absolve the enemy of their role in war. It exposes the moral danger of systems that replace judgment with procedure. Bureaucracy allows cruelty to operate without malice. No one at a veteran's office needed to hate Prince to harm him. They only needed to follow policy. This is one of the most important lessons of the 20th century. Harm does not require hatred. It requires indifference reinforced by structure. His life also teaches that recognition without repair is hollow. Medals, statues, stamps, and speeches cannot substitute for justice. They are symbolic currency used after material obligations are denied. Societies often attempt to correct historical wrongs through narrative rather than action. Telling Prince's story without addressing the systems that destroyed him risks turning his life into a moral performance rather than a call to accountability. The other lesson is about warfare itself. Prince's operations challenged the popular image of combat as constant violence. His most effective actions involved deception, patience, and restraint. He killed hundreds without pulling a trigger because he understood that information is the most lethal weapon on the battlefield. Modern militaries increasingly acknowledge this, yet still struggle to integrate it culturally. Kinetic action is easier to glorify than intelligence work. Visible heroism is easier to reward than invisible effectiveness. Preference shapes military culture and civilian memory alike. Soldiers who fire weapons fit the narrative of bravery. Soldiers who wait, observe, and manipulate perception are harder to mythologize. Prince was uncomfortable for the story Canada wanted to tell. His heroism was subtle, unsettling, and deeply tied to skills the state had spent decades trying to erase. That contradiction could not be resolved without confronting uncomfortable truths about national identity. Also a lesson about time and consequence. Prince's war ended in 1945. Its effects lasted until his death in 1977. Trauma does not obey ceasefires. Policies written in peacetime can inflict wounds as deep as those caused by combat. When societies separate wartime service from peacetime responsibility, they create a moral debt that compounds over generations. Prince paid interest on that debt with his health, his dignity, and his life. The final lesson is perhaps the hardest. Victory does not guarantee virtue. Canada won the war. The Allies defeated fascism. None of that prevented injustice at home. Prince's story dismantles the comforting belief that being on the right side of history ensures moral correctness. Nations can fight evil abroad while maintaining cruelty within their own borders. Recognizing this does not diminish the importance of Allied victory. It deepens it by exposing how incomplete that victory was. He did not fail his country. His country failed him. Not once, but repeatedly, through design rather than accident. His life demonstrates that courage without justice is exploitation, and recognition without repair is betrayal. The lesson is not that societies should avoid war. It is that societies must confront what they do to people after the war ends. And the most enduring lesson of Thomas Prince's life is this: a society reveals its true values not in who it celebrates, but in who it abandons when the usefulness has passed. The continuation of this story does not move forward in time so much as it moves outward, because the life of Thomas Prince does not end cleanly at death. It spreads into institutions, memory, silence, and selective remembrance. His story forces a confrontation with how nations construct meaning from war, how they decide which sacrifices count, and how easily uncomfortable truths are buried beneath ceremony. The war took years from his life, but peace took something far more corrosive: relevance. The guns fell silent. The world wanted closure. Governments needed neat endings, victory parades, clear heroes, and a return to normalcy. Veterans who fit the image of the grateful, compliant citizen soldier were absorbed into the national narrative. They were rewarded, rehabilitated, and reassigned a place in society that made sense to the state. Those who did not fit that image were treated as administrative problems. Thomas Prince was one of them. His existence complicated the story Canada wanted to tell about itself after the war. The state could celebrate his medals without confronting the systems that dehumanized him. It could point to his service as evidence of inclusivity, while continuing policies that denied Indigenous people autonomy, dignity, and equality. This duality was not accidental. It was functional. By elevating the symbol and ignoring the person, the nation avoided accountability. Prince became proof of opportunity rather than evidence of injustice. The pattern is not unique to one country or one war. It is structural. Modern states depend on abstraction. They reduce individuals to categories that can be managed, funded, or ignored. Veterans become files. Trauma becomes a diagnosis. Responsibility becomes eligibility criteria. Once Prince no longer generated operational value, his worth was recalculated according to systems that had never been designed to serve him. The most damaging consequences of this process is moral isolation. Prince did not simply lose material support. He lost acknowledgement. His suffering existed outside public discourse. When societies fail to recognize harm, they compound it. Silence becomes a second wound, often deeper than the first. The absence of recognition tells the victim that their pain is either deserved or irrelevant. Prince lived inside that silence for decades. Silence also served a broader purpose. It protected the national conscience. Acknowledging Prince's treatment would have forced uncomfortable questions about the Indian Act, residential schools, veterans' benefits, and systemic discrimination. It would have disrupted the post-war myth of unity and progress. Instead, his story was fragmented. The war portion was preserved. The aftermath was allowed to fade. The story is not passive. It is curated, What is remembered is chosen, what is forgotten is often inconvenient. Prince's life exposes how selective memory functions as a form of power. By controlling which parts of history are emphasized, societies shape moral narratives that justify present structures. Remembering Prince as a war hero allows admiration without obligation. Remembering him as a man abandoned by his country would require change. Another layer of the lesson lies in how suffering is ranked. Not all trauma is treated equally. Combat wounds are visible, measurable, and familiar. Psychological injury, cultural dislocation, and systemic harm are harder to quantify. They challenge institutions that rely on standardized assessments. Prince's pain did not fit neatly into diagnostic categories. It was cumulative, historical, and deeply personal. As a result, it was often dismissed or misunderstood. Alcohol became a coping mechanism not because Prince lacked discipline, but because he lacked support. Substance abuse is frequently framed as personal failure rather than adaptive response. This framing absolves systems of responsibility and shifts blame onto individuals already damaged by neglect. Prince's decline was not inevitable, it was facilitated by indifference. Also a profound lesson in how skills valued in war are devalued in peace. The abilities that made Prince indispensable on the battlefield, hypervigilance, emotional restraint, tolerance for pain, and comfort with isolation, became liabilities in civilian life. Peace demanded conformity, submission to bureaucracy, and emotional openness within rigid structures. Prince had been trained, both culturally and institutionally, to survive environments that rewarded silence. He was then placed in a society that punished it. Transition failure is common among veterans, but it was magnified for Prince by racism and cultural erasure. He was expected to reintegrate into a society that had never accepted him in the first place. The uniform that once gave him legitimacy was gone. What remained was the identity the state had always tried to suppress. Without the protective layer of military necessity, he became vulnerable again. Another critical lesson concerns the cost of unresolved injustice. When societies refuse to address historical wrongs, those wrongs do not disappear. They manifest in new forms: addiction, poverty, intergenerational trauma, mistrust of institutions. Prince's story is not isolated. It reflects patterns experienced by countless indigenous veterans whose service was exploited and whose lives were discarded. The long-term consequences are visible in communities still grappling with the legacy of these policies. Justice delayed is not neutral. It actively harms. Each year that passed without recognition or support deepened the damage. By the time public acknowledgement arrived, it was too late to help the person who mattered most. Posthumous honors are a form of moral evasion. They allow societies to feel absolved without making restitution. This story also challenges simplistic ideas of heroism. True heroism is not defined by endurance alone. It is defined by what a society does with those who endure. Celebrating suffering without preventing its recurrence is not honor. It is exploitation disguised as respect. Prince was heroic not because he suffered, but because he acted with intelligence, restraint, and courage in situations that demanded it. His suffering afterward was not noble. It was unnecessary. An uncomfortable truth embedded here. Societies often prefer dead heroes to living ones. The dead cannot demand change. They cannot testify, protest, or complicate narratives. Once Prince was gone, his story became safe. It could be told selectively, sanitized, and framed as inspiration rather than indictment. This transformation from inconvenient survivor to symbolic figure is one of the most telling aspects of how power manages memory. Continued relevance of Prince's life lies in what it reveals about modern values. We live in systems that reward visibility over substance, compliance over integrity, and efficiency over care. Prince succeeded when he exploited these blind spots. He was destroyed when he was subjected to them. His life illustrates the paradox of modern institutions. They are capable of immense coordination and equally immense neglect. It's also a lesson for how we understand reconciliation. True reconciliation is not about recognition alone. It requires structural change. It requires dismantling policies that create unequal outcomes. It requires listening to lived experience rather than imposing solutions from above. Prince's story is often cited as evidence of progress, yet it also demonstrates how far that progress remains from sufficient. Education systems, military institutions, and public memory must grapple with these contradictions honestly. Teaching Prince's story without addressing the conditions that shaped it risks turning history into spectacle. The purpose of remembrance should not be comfort. It should be responsibility. The final extension of this lesson reaches beyond history into the present. The mechanisms that failed Prince still exist in modified forms. Bureaucratic indifference, racialized policy, and conditional dignity remain embedded in institutions worldwide. The story asks a question that remains unanswered. Who is being used today in the name of necessity and discarded afterward in the name of procedure? Prince did not ask for sainthood, he asked for fairness. He did not demand gratitude, he needed care. The fact that he received applause instead of support reveals a moral imbalance that persists. His life challenges us to examine not only how we honor the past, but how we treat those who serve now. Continuation of his story is not about closure. It is about accountability. It is about recognizing that the most important battles are not always fought with weapons, and the most damaging failures do not always occur in war. Sometimes, they happen quietly, behind desks, in offices where decisions are justified as policy and consequences are labeled unfortunate. In that sense, Thomas Prince never truly left the battlefield. The terrain simply changed. And the enemy he faced at the end was one he had been fighting his entire life. A system that could recognize his value only when it needed him, and forget him the moment it did not. The story continues not because there is more biography to recount, but because the consequences of Thomas Prince's life did not end with him. His experience became part of a longer pattern that outlived the war, outlived the policies that harmed him, and outlived even the generation that fought beside him. What followed was not resolution, but inheritance. His story passed quietly into families, communities, institutions, and national memory, shaping attitudes long after his name faded from headlines. Many years after his death, Thomas Prince existed in a strange limbo. He was remembered privately by those who knew him, and ignored publicly by those who shaped policy. His medals sat in display cases, separated from the conditions that produced them. The state found it easier to celebrate achievement than to interrogate responsibility. This separation between honor and obligation became normalized. It allowed institutions to claim moral authority while avoiding moral repair. In indigenous communities, his story was understood differently. It was not viewed as a tragic exception, but as confirmation. Prince's life mirrored experiences shared by countless others who served loyally and returned to systems designed to limit them. His struggle was not interpreted as personal failure. It was recognized as structural harm. This distinction matters because it determines where responsibility is placed. One narrative blames the individual, the other indicts the system. The persistence of that second understanding created quiet resistance. Elders told Prince's story not as a heroic legend, but as a warning. They emphasized the cost of service in a society that does not reciprocate loyalty. They taught younger generations to be cautious with institutions that speak the language of opportunity while practicing exclusion. In this way, Prince became part of an oral archive of lived knowledge, passed down not to glorify sacrifice, but to contextualize it. Transmission of memory reveals another lesson. History does not belong solely to archives and textbooks. It lives in stories told at kitchen tables, in community halls, and during moments of collective reflection. Official history often sanitizes complexity to maintain coherence. Community memory preserves contradiction. Prince's life remained alive in those spaces because it resisted simplification. Time, public interest slowly returned. Scholars, journalists, and veterans advocates began revisiting overlooked stories. Prince's name resurfaced alongside questions about indigenous veterans, residential schools, and discriminatory legislation. Yet even this renewed attention carried risk. There was a temptation to frame his story as evidence of progress rather than as proof of unfinished work. Recognition can easily become a substitute for accountability. The language used to describe Prince also began to change. He was increasingly called a symbol. Symbols are powerful, but they are also dangerous. They flatten individuals into representations. They remove agency and replace it with meaning assigned by others. When Prince became a symbol of bravery, reconciliation, or multiculturalism, parts of his story were inevitably erased. Symbols do not demand restitution. People do. Tension exposes a deeper challenge in how societies confront historical injustice. Acknowledgement without transformation allows harm to persist under a new vocabulary. Prince's story risked becoming a tool for institutional self-congratulation rather than self-examination. The danger was not that his story would be forgotten, but that it would be domesticated. Another layer of continuation lies in how military culture absorbed his legacy. Special operations forces often celebrate unconventional thinking, adaptability, and deception. Prince embodied all of these qualities. Yet the cultural roots of his effectiveness were rarely acknowledged. His success was attributed to individual talent rather than to the indigenous knowledge systems that shaped him. This selective attribution allowed the military to extract lessons while avoiding cultural recognition. Isolating his skills from their origins, institutions reinforced the myth that effectiveness emerges solely from training rather than from lived experience. This myth sustained systems that marginalize alternative forms of knowledge. Prince's life challenges that assumption. His abilities were not created by the military, they were refined by it. The distinction matters because it determines whose knowledge is valued and whose is appropriated. Continuation of his story also intersects with broader debates about reconciliation and reparations. Prince's treatment after the war became part of a growing body of evidence demonstrating systemic discrimination against indigenous veterans. This evidence challenged narratives of equal sacrifice and equal reward. It demanded structural response rather than symbolic gestures. Structural change is slow, especially when it requires confronting foundational policies. The Indian Act, veterans' benefit disparities, and institutional racism were not anomalies. They were pillars. Dismantling them required more than apologies. It required redistribution of power and resources. Prince's story highlighted this reality, making it uncomfortable for institutions invested in gradualism. Another important aspect of continuation is intergenerational impact. Trauma does not end with the individual who experiences it. It echoes through families and communities. Prince's struggles affected those around him, shaping relationships, trust, and expectations. The cost of neglect extended beyond one life. It accumulated quietly, reinforcing cycles of marginalization. This intergenerational dimension reframes the question of responsibility. Supporting veterans is not merely about honoring past service. It is about preventing future harm. When institutions fail, individuals like Prince, they also fail those connected to them. The damage multiplies. Addressing it requires long-term commitment rather than episodic recognition. Also a lesson in how Prince's story complicates national identity. Canada, like many nations, constructs its self-image around fairness, tolerance, and moral leadership. Prince's experience disrupts that image. It reveals contradictions between values professed and values practiced. Nations often resist such disruptions because they threaten cohesion, yet avoiding them weakens moral credibility. National maturity involves confronting uncomfortable truths. Prince's life invites that confrontation. It asks whether a nation can claim moral authority abroad while maintaining inequality at home. It challenges the idea that victory in war equates to virtue in peace. These questions remain relevant, not as historical curiosities, but as ongoing tests of integrity. Continuation of Prince's story also highlights the limits of individual resilience. Popular narratives often celebrate the idea that strength can overcome injustice. Prince disproves this myth. He was strong, capable, disciplined, and courageous. None of that protected him from systemic neglect. His life demonstrates that resilience is not a substitute for justice. Without structural support, even the strongest individuals can be broken. Realization carries implications for how societies approach adversity. It shifts focus from individual coping to collective responsibility. It challenges narratives that place the burden of adaptation on those harmed rather than on those causing harm. Prince adapted repeatedly. The system did not. The thread of continuation lies in how Prince's story influences contemporary discussions about service and citizenship. Military service is often framed as the ultimate expression of belonging. Prince served at the highest levels and was still denied full belonging. This contradiction undermines simplistic equations between service and citizenship. It reveals that belonging is mediated by power, not sacrifice. Understanding this helps explain why trust in institutions remains fragile among marginalized communities. When service does not guarantee dignity, loyalty becomes conditional. Prince's experience illustrates why appeals to patriotism alone are insufficient. They must be matched by tangible equity. As the story continued to circulate, it also began to influence how history itself was taught. Educators faced a choice: present Prince as an inspiring exception or as evidence of systemic failure. The former is easier. The latter is more honest. The way his story is framed shapes how future generations understand both war and justice. Seeing him as an exception reinforces the myth that systems work despite isolated failures. Framing him as evidence reveals that systems can function effectively while remaining unjust. This distinction determines whether history becomes a tool for comfort or for change. Continuation of Prince's story ultimately leads back to a fundamental question. What does a society owe those who serve it? Is the debt transactional or moral? Does it end with medals, or does it require sustained care? Prince's life suggests that the answer